Right, competitiveness, concept of competitiveness, really got going in the 1990s, particularly in the EU. Importantly, we were talking about competitiveness of countries. This was a concept borrowed from the management literature and applied to economics. Much of this rhetoric, much of this discourse in the 1990s was fearful in terms, fearful of competitive, low-wage, super-productive China. This idea, or these concepts of competitiveness, got their numerical measure in the Global Competitiveness Report, this annual measure of economic virility that was reported in the English press, certainly in fairly excited tones. You know, England has moved up or down a few places in the Global Competitiveness Report. It became, in the 1990s, so widely accepted, it was almost without discussion. Paul Krugman, in 1994, was a particular exception. He wrote about competitiveness being meaningless, being wrong, and being dangerous. So that is really where I'm taking my inspiration for this talk from. I'm not looking at the concept in general. I'm looking at the concept, or looking at two specific reports on competitiveness. One written by the Competitiveness Support Fund, heavily funded by USAID, and one, Pakistan Growth and Export Competitiveness, written by the World Bank. Now, I see there's a lot of value in looking at these particular reports. These are not just academic musings. These are written by two heavily influential organizations. I know people like Professor Zaidi have argued institutions like the USAID and the World Bank have been heavily influential in policy making. So these are some, I guess, inside tracks into influences on policy making in Pakistan. Right, first of all, one problem with both of these reports, there's no clear definition of competitiveness. We can come away from this not really knowing what we're talking about. This price is a bit important, productivity seems to be important, but both reports really dominated by just a long list of factors that are somehow assumed to be related to competitiveness. Both of them draw very heavily on the World Economic Forum, this annual Global Competitiveness Report, which adds hundreds of factors, well, not hundreds, dozens of factors into an index of global competitiveness. But the aims of both of these reports are very, very explicit. Both of them seek to inform and influence policymakers. Both reports present a detailed list of policy suggestions. So I'm going to evaluate these two reports using here four criteria. Are they theoretically, empirically consistent? Do they make sense? Are the policies they advocate feasible? Do they make good use of the evidence from comparable countries? And do they learn lessons, draw upon previous reform efforts? But first of those, theoretical and empirical consistency. Unfortunately, both of these reports are absolutely riddled rather, with theoretical and empirical inconsistencies. Both reports unambiguously, uncritically make assumptions about economic theory. They assume more property, more protection of property rights, the better. They assume more trade openness, the better. They assume more capital account openness, the better. More education, the better. None of them engage with the fact that all of these concepts are very widely debated, very controversial in the literature. For example, many have argued that trade liberalisation can be beneficial only in certain situations, and more so perhaps for an industrial exporter than an agricultural producer, more beneficial at a time when the world economy is expanding. These reports ignore all of those complexities and make very simplistic assumptions. They make huge distortions to trade theory. If you look at any basic textbook of international economics, trade liberalisation is good. According to the doctrine of comparative advantage, countries produce according to what they're best at. There's mutual gain from trade. However, suddenly we're leaping into a world of competitiveness Trade is a zero-sum game. It's a battle, it's a war. The gains from one country, or the gains in competitiveness of one country, are at the expense of another country. Now, oddly, we have to go right back to the 1960s for a flourishing school which argued development of one country was at the expense of development of another country, the neo-Marxists like Andre Gunnar-Frank. So quite inadvertently, World Bank and the USA seem to have embraced neo-Marxism from the 1960s. Krugman pointed out that competitiveness has very little meaning when we think of it in terms of countries. Yes, when we talk about corporations, the sales of Pepsi are largely at the extent, or an increase in the sales by Pepsi are largely at the expense of sales by Coca-Cola. This does not, we cannot generalize this concept to the case of countries. Countries, yes, might compete for markets, but they are also each other's markets, they are also the source of important inputs. You cannot generalize from the case of firms right the way up to the level of entire economies. Both of these reports very explicitly make the statement that international competitiveness is a key constraint on long-run economic growth. So improving competitiveness will increase the country's potential for long-run economic growth. This is nonsense. If we look at Pakistan, just as most other developing countries, the overwhelming dominant influences on economic growth are domestic factors. Consumption, investment, government expenditure. We had the presentation from Dr. Mahmood earlier pointing out investment and public expenditure being the key driving influences on Pakistan, not this nebulous concept of international competitiveness. If, I just got a bit of data, if we look at, this is the 2004-5, if we look on the left column, top 10 countries in the world according to international competitiveness in 2005, right-hand column, growth rates in 2004-5. It's not perfect, it's just 1 year's worth of data, but that's more than either of these reports do. And generally we can say competitive countries have positive but slow rates of economic growth. If we were to look at the fastest growing countries in the world in the same period, we would oddly enough find out that they have generally experienced, or they have very low levels of competitiveness. So the competitiveness report seems to, the actual practicalities of it are exactly the opposite from what it states. Low competitive countries seem to grow very rapidly. Right, feasibility. Both reports are very, very explicit that they are advocating a big push in policy reform. They talk about simultaneous reforms, or comprehensive reforms, or deep reforms. For example, the competitiveness support program, that one funded by USA, in 1 year, this is their list of priority reforms for 1 year, just 1 year, they advocate passing legislation to protect intellectual property rights, passing a corporate restructuring law, shifting to e-government, mobilizing extra resources, an anti-corruption campaign, reforming the judiciary, and implementing uniform public procurement rules in all government agencies. Is that feasible? Well, both reports make quite clear they're talking nonsense. Both of them talk about the low and declining capacity of the state, the government, the bureaucracy in Pakistan to implement reforms. It's a kind of bizarre paradox. Neither of them make any attempt to prioritize reforms. Reforms are a big lump just thrown at the Pakistan government. Both of them completely ignore the historical context. Professionalizing the bureaucracy and implementing independent judiciary took Britain the best part of 100 years. The Competitiveness Support Forum have given Pakistan all of a year to undertake the same process. They ignore the cost of policy reform. They present policy reforms as something that can be done simply by the stroke of a pen. Danny Roderick, one example, estimated the cost of being compliant with WTO health, safety, phytosanitary laws, definitions and so on, WTO, all those WTO compliance, cost in 2000 about $150 million. So they are not feasible. Comparative studies, both reports make it very clear that competitiveness is a relative term. It's fair enough. Competitiveness against whom, or competitiveness when compared to whom. Both compare Pakistan very unfavourably with a large number of other large developing countries or other Asian countries. Both draw incredibly simplistic and naive lessons. For example, they say, well, South Korea, it's very successful, it has high levels of education, therefore Pakistan should implement high levels of education, as if high levels of education is something that can be just plucked out of the air. World Bank argue that Pakistan should rush ahead and implement the special economic zone legislation. So to pass clear land and allow firms to invest, and it to be a free trade zone, limited labour laws and so on. Both of them have completely ignored what's happening over the border. Special economic zones in India have collapsed in chaos. Massive political opposition, for example, stalled the $12 billion Costco South Korea investment in Orissa. Massive opposition against the valuation of assets when assets are being claimed, the process of evicting people who live on the land, and the non-payment of compensation. Massive politicization and problems with the process in India. In Pakistan, very blithely, these two organizations advocate that Pakistan should pass all of this legislation inside of a year. So, very simplistic lessons are being drawn, and inevitably this is going to produce very distortionary policy. Past policy interventions, they all, for example, advocate reforming education, improving teacher salary, oversight of teacher, building infrastructure, employing or educating more girls' rural schools, etc., etc. Neither of them make anything more than a very, very passing reference to the social action program, rather notorious piece of donor-funded intervention in the 1990s. It cost $8 billion, was intended to improve the education system. It ended up leading to a slight fall in female school enrollment and slightly lower expenditure on the social sectors. It would seem a fairly obvious thing to talk about for advocating education reform in Pakistan, particularly if you're the one that funded the social action program, but both of them more or less completely ignore it. Now, a very notorious example of this is the IMF and tax reform. Right, 1995, IMF gives Pakistan a large amount of money, and you can see revenue, expenditure measures, cut the budget deficit. 1996, a year later, another large amount of money. This is cut and pasted from the IMF website. They said, yeah, we've got to tax base, rationalise government expenditure, structural reform, mobilise more tax revenue. 1997, another large amount of money. Notice the keywords there. Domestic tax base, broaden tax administration. And I won't bore you. 2002, 2002 again, 2003, 2003 again, 2003. Note all the keywords reappearing there. Tax, reduction, tax exemptions. 2004, more money, more conditionalities. 2008, 2009, 2009, 2010. And finally, after 15 relentless years of this, I went through the thesaurus there, IMF cajoling, assisting, pressurizing, enticing, persuading, inveigling, flattering, and coaxing Pakistan to reform its tax system and spending billions of dollars in the process. What happened to tax revenue? So you probably all know the punchline here. Well, nothing. Well, if I'm being kind, I would say nothing. If I was being truthful, I would probably say it fell slightly. So despite all of that effort, that relentless rhetoric, that relentless list of conditionality, billions of dollars, nothing happened. Now, being rather rude here, here's a picture of Albert Einstein, who very famously said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Now, the IMF are not, as far as I know, insane. But anyway, why this whole farce continued and continues, I suppose I leave for another paper. But did the Competitiveness Support Forum and the World Bank learn from this fairly catastrophic experience? Well, clearly not. Here is 2 quotes from those reports. The CSF are hoping to double tax revenues in the next few years, and the World Bank is calling for, yawn, a comprehensive strategy to increase tax revenues, tax collections, broaden the base, etc., etc. It could have been cut and paste, as I did from the IMF's website. Now, reforms, policy advice, or exhortation that pass as policy advice that are just parachuted into a country with no conception, no understanding of history or the Pakistan economy are doomed to be a dead end. There are very good reasons why tax revenue is low in Pakistan. The service sector is very big, services are hard to tax. There are political constraints on trade taxation. There's a very large informal economy in Pakistan. Elites are quite happy not being taxed in Pakistan. Easy access to foreign aid has probably squeezed out efforts to boost tax revenue. I think Dr. Irfan earlier pointed out low tax revenue is actually a feature of all countries in South Asia. Now, nowhere in these reports is there any attempt to really get to grips with the reality of Pakistan, to understand the politics, the political economy of Pakistan, and come up with a feasible, realistic solution to raise tax revenue. Instead, policy advice is just relentless exhortation. So, conclusion, for some, competitiveness is dangerous. These reports have burdened the Pakistan government with an overwhelming number of policy priorities. They have completely ignored the cost of implementing those policies. There's no conception of trade-offs. For example, tax revenue through trade taxes is relatively easy to collect. You have low administration, low capacity in the state. It probably makes sense to rely on trade taxes. However, trade liberalisation has undermined, you see that fall over the 1990s, undermined the ability to raise revenue. Competitiveness is distorting, riddled with theoretical and empirical inconsistencies. It is also a dead end. It ignores the social, political and historical context of Pakistan, resulting in sadly useless policy advice. Right, go for a halt there.